Hi, good afternoon. A very warm welcome at the session Getting a Grip on Disinformation. My name is Mieke van Hezenwijk and I work at the SIDN Fund, which is an internet fund based in the Netherlands, and we're trying to fund an open, free, safe internet. And in this regard, we funded a couple of projects last year, tools mainly, who try to get a grip on disinformation, which is a really huge problem. Also, the last couple of days, of course, in the war between Russia and Ukraine, it's becoming more eminent that this is really a huge problem. So that's why we organized this session. We did it together with the University of Amsterdam. Stijn Peters will start with a presentation on the problem of disinformation. What is it? It's a huge problem, but also has a lot of different angles. Then we will proceed with Erik van Summeren, who is the founder of RedditTube, a research search tool for YouTube, but he will explain all about it later. And in the end, Merel Borger, who is the director of Limelight Foundation, will reflect on how foundations can help solving a bit of this problem, of course, but that's when you have any questions, just ask them in the chat, and then I would like to give the word to Stijn Peters.
Yeah, thank you, Mieke. Good afternoon, everyone. So it's my honor to kick off this session with a brief, broader introduction about misinformation then. And to that end, I want to talk about two questions. So what is misinformation? And maybe more importantly, what can we do to counter it? And to answer that second question, I want to zoom in on a particular method of countering it, which is fact-checking, and particularly fact-checking through open source intelligence, or OSINT. So the goal here is to give you a bit of a practical context about the issue that is central to this session, and then we will zoom in on some more specific aspects of it in the other talks. So on that first question, what is misinformation? I think everyone will have a basic idea of what we're talking about here, which is information that is somehow fake, false, or wrong. But I want to briefly discuss definitions anyway, just to sort of set the stage for the rest of this and be clear about what we're talking about here. So recently, the term misinformation has been used to describe misleading news or information. But you could say it's rapidly losing meaning in a way, because, for example, the Russian government is now using it to basically describe whatever they disagree with concerning their invasion of Ukraine. And the same way, Donald Trump redefined fake news a couple of years ago, also as something that basically describes whatever he disagrees with. For now, we can use the term misinformation with the understanding that in this case, it means news or information about current events that is factually incorrect. Perhaps in a couple of years, we'll need a new term because this one has lost all meaning. For now, it still serves our purposes. So that's misinformation. And then there's disinformation or desinformation. So that is a word that is often used interchangeably with misinformation, but the difference is that disinformation refers to information that is intentionally misleading. So there's an example here of Russia making claims about what Ukraine is doing in the current war going on in Ukraine that they probably know to be false, but they have strategic purposes behind trying to spread this misinformation. So there's someone behind it who knows what they're spreading is wrong or false, and they're doing it intentionally to mislead people. Whereas if we're talking about misinformation, the people spreading it may believe that it is correct. And of course, this information can turn into misinformation if it's spread further by other people after being released who don't know that it's false. But it's useful to distinguish these two things, because if you want to do something about it, it makes quite a difference if someone's acting in bad or good faith. And most of the efforts to counter misinformation or disinformation do take that into account, because there's a lot more to gain if someone is acting in good faith and isn't out to mislead people intentionally. So with that out of the way, let's turn to the €1,000,000 question. What can we do about it? So it's clear that this is a major problem. We have 2 years of a pandemic behind us now in which misinformation about the COVID-19 virus was a major problem to the extent that people died in hospitals, not believing that the disease they were dying from actually existed. So if you look at, again, the invasion of Ukraine, this has become an information war next to a conventional war, with many people pushing misleading narrative about what's going on there, intentionally, but also often unintentionally. So it's clearly a major problem. And unfortunately, no one has found a definitive answer to the question of how to fix it comprehensively so far. But we're not completely lost. A couple of things can be done. None of these are a surefire way of getting rid of it, but they all do help. This is something people are studying very closely at the moment, seeing what works and what doesn't. So one common way of doing this is to invest in debunking misinformation, to make sure that people have access to the right information too, and point out the mistakes they may be seeing. This is an example of that, of Facebook adding on fact-checking to posts on their platform. Another example of something you can do to counter this is to simply throw spreaders of misinformation off a platform. So for example, Facebook and Twitter ban certain conspiracy theories from being discussed. They're not always so effective in actually enforcing that rule, but it is part of their guidelines. And in a more extreme version of that, the EU just banned Russian state-sponsored media outlets from the public sphere wholesale. That is a complicated proposition because you also have to keep values like the freedom of press in mind, but it can be quite effective in curbing the spread of misinformation and disinformation. And then you can also invest in people to make it possible for them to recognize misinformation on their own, or at least be critical of the information they consume and maybe do some of their own fact-checking. That is often referred to as media literacy. This is a screenshot from a TikTok video that does a great job of explaining how to spot misinformation. There's a lot of junk on TikTok, but also quite a bit of educational content like this. So all of these things, debunking, deplatforming, education, they're being done. None of these things solve the problem on their own necessarily, or even together, but they can definitely make a difference. So let's take a look at the practical side of that for a moment. And if we then go back to fact-checking and debunking, probably the most famous approach here is to add some sort of disclaimer to misinformation. And this starts from a premise that holds for basically anything you might try to counter misinformation, that you need to provide an alternative. That is information that can be taken in instead of the misinformation, that you can point at and say, actually, this is how it works. So one way of doing that is to take a claim and then declare it either true or false. And then put that next to the misinformation. So Facebook experimented with this a little bit. They funded some fact checkers to provide context that they then showed next to what they considered to be false claims. And one issue with that is that this is a pretty top-down way of addressing things. So if you're skeptical of the mainstream narrative, as many people who might be sharing misinformation are, you're probably also skeptical of a fact check that Facebook, which is a pretty mainstream site, and also the subject itself of quite a bit of misinformation, you'll probably be skeptical of a fact check that Facebook put next to your claim. So doing this fact checking and debunking from a top-down perspective with a claim to authority is not always effective. But in the past few years, a more bottom-up method of fact checking has gained some prominence as an alternative, not necessarily originating from a platform like Facebook, but from basically other users of a platform. So this often uses what is called open source intelligence, which is basically using freely available information to research some sort of claim or piece of information. And a lot of people doing that are not really affiliated with a platform or a newspaper or a journalistic outlet, but instead they publish these facts on these fact checks on their own websites or on social media accounts. Just bit by bit showing pieces of evidence linking to other sites and so on, in a way that is very easy to share, to reuse, to point at, without necessarily attributing the fact checking to a big platform that might be suspicious to some people. So since that is an increasingly prominent way of fact checking at the moment, I want to zoom in on that a little bit more. So the basic format of that is that people look at some sort of footage that is being spread, an image, a video, and then use metadata and publicly available data sources like reverse image search, like Google Maps, like you see here on the screen, to figure out where it's coming from, whether it can be trusted, and so on. And this practice has been growing for a couple of years now, with collectives like Bellingcat doing this in a decentralized, crowdsourced way. And while in essence, this is also fact-checking, the format is in some cases a lot more effective because it's often done in a very shareable and transparent way, with a lot of links to Google Maps, to places where you can go to basically reproduce the research and the fact-check yourself. So that can be more convincing than a platform just pushing a message in your face saying what you're doing is wrong. And this is actually something that more traditional news sources are now also adopting. This is the Dutch public broadcaster NOS. So that seems a relatively promising model. And in essence, is still fact-checking, but with a format that is perhaps a bit more accessible, convincing, and also effective than a platform unilaterally declaring something to be true or false. So for that mode of debunking using open source intelligence, using publicly available data sources, let's zoom in on that for a second. It's not always so easy to find your way through all that public data that you can use to verify a claim, because there's a lot of it out there. Every day, more than 500 million new tweets are added, and that's just one platform that you maybe want to keep track of and search through. So on the screen here is me scrolling to a public list of platforms and tools and resources. It's basically endless, as you can see. So a lot of people, including myself and some of the other people in this panel, are working on building tools to make that kind of data searchable and find ways to monitor it and find the relevant information in this basically giant haystack. And that is necessary in two ways when studying and countering misinformation. On the one hand, you need to sift through the data to find and identify the misinformation in this big pile of data. And on the other hand, you want to be able to find the data that you need to maybe present the alternative narrative. So you want to be able to find other tweets that reference the same image or video, for example, maybe with an alternate framing and so on. Because it's not always so clear where the boundary between good and misinformation is. For example, one common form of misinformation is using footage of a previous event to then present it as footage of a current event. We're seeing a lot of footage from earlier conflicts that involve Ukraine or Russia that are being presented as depicting the current invasion. So then the information or the media, the image or the video in itself isn't fake or false, but the way it's being framed is where the problem lies. So to effectively counter that and do a proper and believable analysis of what you find, you need to be able to trace the footage through social media, get a sense of where it's being used and how it's being used and so on. There are a lot of tools to do that. There's no time to really get into them specifically. Suffice to say, this is a pretty active area of work. One of the tools will be talked about by Eric in a minute. And one thing to maybe note there is that unfortunately, some platforms are far easier to get data from than others. For example, Twitter and YouTube, quite accessible. TikTok and Instagram actively resist data collection and are a lot more difficult to work with. So even when you're technically skilled and know what's going on, it's not always so easy to get the data you need to do a proper analysis of information you come across online. Fortunately, there are many sites and organizations that provide resources on how to find your way through the jungle of platforms and tools. Here are a couple of examples. These are all organizations that have guides and collections of links to get you up to speed on this topic and that provide information on how you might effectively investigate claims and things shared on social media. So bottom line, misinformation, debunking, open source intelligence, it's a very dynamic field at the moment, as you can imagine. I hope this has served as a necessarily brief introduction to the topic. And here I'll pass on the mic to Erik, I think, as the next speaker to zoom in on some of these things I've talked about a little bit more.
Thank you, Stijn. Yeah, I'm Erik.
Or Mike, oh, okay, there you go.
Oh, wait.
We can hear you now.
I'm co-founder of RedditTube, and one of the tools Stijn is talking about. And we're building a tool that enables researchers and journalists to do research towards YouTube, which you can do thanks to the support of SIDN Funds and the Limelight Foundation. Every minute, 500 hours of video are uploaded to YouTube. It has a massive footprint, yet at the same time, the platform itself remains a black box. Especially compared to other platforms such as Twitter and Facebook, it's stubbornly difficult to find problematic content. And as a result, extremism researchers, journalists, advocacy organizations, and even tech platforms themselves are unable to root out, monitor, or solve for the problem. And if we go to the next slide, I'll talk a bit about why it's so difficult to do research towards YouTube. There are two important problems. The personal recommendation algorithm hides this sort of harmful content if you're not actively engaging with it. And secondly, the video format makes it much more time consuming to do research. And for that reason, many researchers have focused on less time consuming textual platforms, such as Telegram and Facebook. So the solution, if you go on to the next slide, that we're working on is in order to make research towards YouTube more accessible, we're applying an innovative approach in channel discovery with machine learning to make it possible to uncover, analyze, and monitor this sort of content. And to show a couple examples of how RedditTube has been used so far, journalists at the London Times have used the tool to find anti-vax videos, which are still being monetized despite YouTube's policy to not monetize those videos. Fact checker Brecht Kassel from Belgian magazine Knak used RedditTube to find out how a conspiracy theory spread on YouTube. And research at Harvard Schornstein Center have used RedditTube to do research towards election fraud conspiracy theories around the 2020 US presidential election. Those are just a few of the use cases and problems that we're focusing on, but we're also seeing early and promising results on use cases for local and remote journalism in difficult to access geographical areas, on voice into usage, what Stein was talking about, on foreign influence operations in which YouTube is used to influence public opinion. And to, if you can go back one slide, wait, and if you move one forward. Oh, that's weird. Okay, that's okay. So we're missing one slide here, but to give an example of how RedditTube helps to solve for problems of radicalization on YouTube, we look at Nick Fuentes. Why do we care about Nick Fuentes? Because Nick Fuentes is a hugely influential right-wing extremist. He has been deplatformed from YouTube around 1.5 years ago, but using RedditTube shows that he still has a massive presence on the platform. And this is, if you go back one slide again, this is real data we collected from RedditTube. And the y-axis here shows the views, and the x-axis shows the dates. And the red vertical line indicates the date that Fuentes got deplatformed. And every circle on the left of that line indicates a single video featuring Nick Fuentes. If we go to the next slide, we're also seeing the Fuentes videos that have been uploaded to YouTube after he got deplatformed. If you compare the video views in the green circle with the videos before his removal, you see that something very interesting has happened in the distribution of those Fuentes videos. The average video received less views than when Fuentes still had his own YouTube channel, but members of his community became much more active in reposting Fuentes videos or started uploading short clips on their own channels. And what's interesting here is that if you aggregate all those views together, you end up with almost the same amount of views as the original Nick Fuentes channel had. So why does this matter? If you go on to the next slide. Yes, yeah, that one. So Fuentes' presence on the platform radicalizes others, give them a bigger audience, and influences their narratives. Here's a picture of a few of them and how it directly translates to violence. We missed one slide, but the guy on the right here is, oh, if you go back, yeah, the guy on the right here is Nick Fuentes. And on the left, we have Baked Alaska, who's infamously known for live streaming the attack on the Capitol. And on the right, we have figures such as Wuzu and Lols, who are live streaming fistfights and other acts of often racially inspired violence. And before I move on to show the tool itself, if we go to the next slide, I want to talk about this other example of the radicalization of a YouTuber on a channel level. So this YouTuber is in her early teens, and if you look at her early videos, she's doing the regular YouTube stuff, such as a day in my life videos, unboxing, and makeup videos. But all of these videos aren't really picking up, and each of them are receiving a couple hundred views. And if we go to the next slide, you see that one day she posts this video on the Wayfair conspiracy, which is this conspiracy on young children being sold in closets on an American online furniture store called Wayfair. And the views on this video really blow up. Instead of the couple hundred views that she normally gets, she ends up with 157,000 video views. And what I find so striking about this particular example is that it shows so clearly what this sort of engagement does to her as a creator. Because from there on, she completely focuses on conspiracy videos. And instead of creating 1 or 2 videos a month, she goes to 6 videos in 3 weeks. So now let's look at how the tool works to uncover these actors. And for this, we use 5 Nick Fuentes videos that are still active. And we enter them on the discovery tool, and then we wait for the crawler to do its work. And if you go to the next slide, I'll explain a bit how this works under the hood. Because it basically works by capturing the user profiles that commented on these 5 initial Nick Fuentes videos. It then checks the source of other content this user is engaging with. So to initially find these videos, we're not really looking at the content itself, but we're mostly looking at videos that have a similar audience. And if you go to the next video, there should be a video that we can play. And once the crawler has finished, we find thousands of channels that have been viewed by users watching Nick Fuentes videos. And not all of these channels are relevant for us, of course, because someone that watches Nick Fuentes videos probably also has interest beyond Fuentes. So on a channel level, we can quickly filter out relevant videos that are specifically mentioning the topics that you are interested in. And from there on, we can add those channels for future tracking, or we can search within the video content of the channels that we found here. And to show it in a bit more detail, if you go to the next slide. As I mentioned earlier, the second big problem with YouTube is that it takes too much time to watch these videos manually. So let's say I want to know which videos are specifically mentioning reptilian conspiracies. And this is a conspiracy theory propagated in far-right and extremist circles, talking about aliens disguised as human beings trying to take over the world. And if you play the video, you can kind of see how the tool works.
Sense of like, oh, you guys are into UFOs and reptilians and blah blah blah. It's like, stop thinking, stop looking. With
was not about alien reptilians. It was actually about the satanic snake, which is a reptile. And I've had some very
inside of mountains. The reptilians like it hot. They choose the Middle East.
That made clones, unique clones of themselves. The reptilians rarely clone themselves. It's an insult to their greater population. So that their clone would...
you can pause the video. Like the magic here is kind of that instead of like watching these videos manually, that sometimes can easily take up to 2 hours each, you can basically skim through those videos as if you're skimming through a book. So if we go over to the next and last slide, the video was just showing as part of an earlier prototype. And we recently got to a stage in which the tool is much more scalable and allows for users to discover and add their own channels, kind of like a CrowdTangle for YouTube. And we're currently looking for beta users. If you think it could be useful for you, then please reach out to eric@redditube.com. And with that being said, I'd like to hand it over to Merel Borger from the Limelight Foundation.
Thank you, Erik. Maybe just 1 second before you start, Merel. Does anybody have a question for Erik or for Stijn before we move on? Mm-hmm. Okay, Merel, go ahead.
Thank you. So hi everyone, my name is Merel Borger. I'm the director of Limelight Foundation. Next slide, please. We are an independent philanthropic foundation based in the Netherlands. We're brand new, we exist almost 1 year now. And in a nutshell, what we're about is supporting a strong and free information ecosystem in the digital age. Next slide. And why are we doing this? Because citizens, we all need independent information to make informed decisions about our private and public lives. And Limelight Foundation promotes a strong and free information ecosystem to make sure that independent quality information is available and accessible to all. And how are we doing this? We support journalism and civil society organizations that protect, strengthen, and sustain this information ecosystem. And this word information ecosystem might come across as somewhat abstract, but we deliberately chose to use this term because it implies that for securing this free flow of information, we need much more than just supporting independent media or supporting journalism. And this slide shows how we, oh, sorry, you can go back to the previous slide, thanks. It shows how we look at this information ecosystem. This is definitely not a perfect representation of this information ecosystem, but it's an attempt to get to grips with everything in terms of developments and dimensions and themes that is going on in this wider ecosystem. So I will talk you through this somewhat complex picture. And in doing so, I will also explain how our involvement with countering online disinformation fits into our approach. Okay, next slide. Yeah, we have divided this information ecosystem into 3 circles, and all of these are needed to secure the free flow of information. And Limelight Foundation aims to invest in all 3 of these circles. So the first circle, this is what you see here. It's really the core of what we're all about. It revolves around the production and distribution of quality information. And this really is also as a counterweight to online disinformation. And we focus as Limelight Foundation on promoting the production and distribution of in-depth journalism. A lot of explanatory and investigative journalism here, and with a specific focus on innovation of new ways of storytelling, innovation of new ways of doing journalism, new ways of working together, a lot of collaboration, also redesigning the relationship between journalists and audiences, hopefully to get better in tune with the specific questions and needs and concerns that members of the audience, citizens, have with regards to what's going on in society, hopefully to eventually be able to rebuild public trust in media and institutions in one another. Next slide, please. This second circle deals with, we've labeled it infrastructure. So the necessary direct infrastructure for journalists to be able to do their work. You can think of organizations working on journalists' digital safety and security, organizations providing legal support to journalists doing their work. And for instance, very recently, our support to the establishment of a press hub in Lviv in Western Ukraine, which is going to be a support center for journalists covering the conflict and for journalists going into the country to do so, but really also journalists having to flee the country to get themselves into safety. And then the third circle, thanks, that deals with the wider enabling environment for well-functioning information ecosystem, and really the necessary preconditions that we need for this. And well, there's a lot of different dimensions again going on here. And I think to summarize this, there are not so much journalism organizations involved in this enabling environment, but more often campaigning organizations or advocacy organizations working on these preconditions. And you can think about civil society organizations promoting digital rights. And for instance, in that regard, also working on better regulation of platforms, and thus dealing with some of the underlying problems of our information ecosystem. And we have also singled out countering online disinformation here, because we chose to also support very targeted interventions to better understand this phenomenon and to get to better grips with it, as was the title of the joint call that we did with the SIDN Fund. So to summarize, I think Limelight's approach to countering disinformation consists of promoting independent quality information, providing infrastructure for journalists to provide this kind of information, addressing the underlying issues and enabling conditions of our information ecosystem, and from time to time supporting very targeted interventions with regard to disinformation.
Thank you, Merel. Does anybody have any questions for Merel at this point? No, not at the moment. I was wondering, Alistair.
Yeah, hi. I was really interested in that, and I just wondered if you look a lot at supporting journalists. I was wondering about supporting other kind of campaign groups, if you've got any projects around that, because, for example, I've been engaging with like climate activists and LGBT activists, all of whom are not really specialists in this field, but desperately need information and support on actually countering disinformation in their campaigns, in their activities, and to protect the people they work with.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think it's a really good one. I think overall, I would say that Limelight Foundation does not deal with specific topics or themes like climate change or LGBT rights. However, so we have, let's say, one big issue, and that's a well-functioning information ecosystem. Having said that, there are several interventions that we currently have that deal with, let's say, bringing together digital rights and other types of civil society organizations coming from social and economic justice perspectives or climate perspective, or, well, many other areas. So in that sense, it's definitely part of what we're currently doing. However, I think it's an interesting remark that you're making, and that we should definitely take into account going forward. Yeah, thanks.
Great, thanks. Yeah, no, I mean, maybe I actually can follow up with you afterwards on a couple of things I know of. That'd be great.
Are you involved in countering disinformation, Alistair?
Yeah, I am. I've been researching and doing training projects on it last year. So we did a session yesterday, which a couple of people here were at as well. We did a training course with Georgian civil society, which included people from Ukraine and other places in Southeastern Europe. And I've done workshops here. I'm based in Berlin with Disruption Labs on it as well. So yeah, it's a big area of interest. And I think, recently I've also been, as I said, working with different activist groups on different issues who are not specialists in this area, who want some help on this kind of area, on this kind of topic, in a really easy, accessible way.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting.
Maybe, can I say something to Alistair?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so I was thinking support from the SIDN Fund and us to RedditTube, for instance. This tool is obviously something that could very well be applied by many different stakeholders, including journalists and civil society organizations.
Completely. I think it's a really fantastic tool. I was really impressed actually with it. And it's definitely one, it's just getting the information to the right people, packaging it in a way that people can really take it and got really easy practical steps they can take when they can see something weird is happening on their social media channels or on the issues they're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe taking this moment because we're going to launch another call on getting a grip on disinformation within 2 weeks from SIDN Fund and Limelight Foundation.
Okay.
So maybe you can take a look at our website and figure out if you can apply for a project.
Great.
Then I have a question from Douglas. Douglas, do you want to be audible, or shall I read out your question to RedditTube? No microphone. Okay. Erik, did you read the question?
Yeah, I read it.
Could you repeat it a bit?
Yes, the question is about the classification of certain channels. So what happens right now is that we have around 10 classifications, including alt-right, and Jordan Peterson, a Canadian psychologist, and Christian Finger is classified as alt-right. And I mean, there's an issue indeed with the classifications of things. It's really difficult to classify many of these channels because it's often not really clear whether something is alt-right or whether alt-right is still even a term or whether things are just conservative. But at the same time, to make sense of things, there's also a bit of a need to classify, and especially if you look at more quantitative research that rely on classified data sets. And I mean, we know there's issues with those classifications at times, and how we try to fix this in the future is by allowing researchers to classify their own channels. And I think in that way, we'll probably be able to give a better sense of like what sort of category these channels exactly fit in. But yeah, this is still a work in progress and something that's just, quite difficult to figure out at times. I hope that answers your question, Douglas.
Okay, thank you. Then I have a question. I don't know, maybe for Stijn, but I have the feeling that the war between Russia and Ukraine is taking disinformation to the next level. So all people who thought before, well, it's not that big of a problem, I think everybody's aware that it is a huge problem. Do you think so as well? And what would be the next steps from governments to take to counter this this digital war?
I think there's a nuance that can be made there, that I think in any war you will find that propaganda is a huge factor. So in that sense, the fact that this is an information war as well as a conventional war is not so much a new thing. But of course, it has a new scale perhaps because now we have the internet, and in the Second World War we didn't, for example. So there are a lot of more places where that information war is happening. It's not just spreading leaflets from planes, but it's also stuff on the internet that you need to take into account. And I think in terms of what a government can do, of course, there's something to be said for keeping an eye on media literacy, promoting educational programs, and so on. But I think a couple of things that a government can actually play a role in is one, ensuring a free press, which seems like an obvious thing to say, but unfortunately isn't actually so obvious in a lot of countries. And you see that in the absence of a free press, things can go sideways really quickly. So promoting a healthy media ecosystem is, I think, very important. And in terms of what a government can also do is, I think they could play a bigger role in ensuring that people who are investigating misinformation have the tools they need to do so. A lot of platforms on which misinformation is being spread are very hard to really research in depth because they make it very hard for analysts, researchers, journalists to actually get data from them. For example, if you look at TikTok, which is obviously a big platform at the moment, if you go by the letter of TikTok's license agreement, you can't even make a screenshot. That's forbidden. Obviously, there are provisions in the laws of a lot of European countries, at least, that allow you to override that for research or journalistic purposes. But the fact remains that these platforms actively counter analysis of what happens on there. So I think governments have a role to play there in maybe speaking to these platforms and finding a way for journalists and analysts, independent analysts, as well as researchers in institutions to actually get access to that data, to be able to get a better idea of what actually is going on.
Yeah, thank you. I'm personally active in the internet technical community, and there was a lot of debate going on about, I don't know, shutting down the .ru domain, or now in the Netherlands, a couple of hosting providers shut down websites. To me, that always sounds really tricky because we are going into censorship. So who in the end does have a say in this environment?
Well, in the end, it's the EU that decided that these sites can't be available anymore. And apparently they have the power to do that because now they aren't anymore. And I agree that there's a very big discussion to be had. Like, is this the way to go? On the one hand, you could say, if we're talking about a free press, that includes all kinds of voices, including those funded by the Russian government. On the other hand, people have been saying, well, this is an exceptional situation. It's a war. There's a party in a war, being the Russian government, who is explicitly using these outlets for their own propaganda purposes. In a war, different rules apply. I don't know if you can really make the case so black and white, because you could also say, well, we are not currently at war with Russia as such. So I don't think there's a clear answer to that, but I do definitely share your reservations about just banning these outlets outright, and at the same time making a claim that in Europe there is a free press, because there is a tension there that needs to be addressed, I think.
Yeah, the problem is that the internet goes beyond Europe, of course. Yeah. Does anyone else has an opinion about this one?
I'm just thinking that that is a conversation that journalism funders are now having with regards to the situation in Ukraine. What happens if Russia takes over and shuts down internet there? I mean, we might not have a very black and white approach with regards to doing things like these, but our counterpart might have. Yeah. So how to circumvent those type of strategies?
Yeah, that's a difficult one.
Yeah, very difficult one.
Yeah, I don't know. Stijn, Erik, Merel, do you want to tell something else or give a vision on this problem?
Not much beyond what I've said already. I do want to maybe once more emphasize that RedditTube is a really cool tool, and I'll be trying to use it myself too, because do some hype manship for Erik here.
Yeah, thanks for those kind words. Appreciate it. No, that is being used. Yeah.
Okay. Well, then I think. Liz.
Hi, good morning. I just wanted to say, Rhett, so I do research on disinfo, and I work in an outfit that, we work on disinformation that targets Latinos in the United States. And YouTube is such a challenge for us because it is so time consuming. This is amazing. So I'm hoping to work with you and see what can be done. It's a challenge because it's time consuming, but also because so much of the resources that are dedicated to this are really focused on English language. And, the ability to do something like this where you can just put in a keyword and it doesn't matter, what the language is really amazing. I'm excited. I'm sitting here digging through your website as you all are talking. This is really amazing stuff. So thank you so much for your work on this project.
Yeah, thank you so much for those kind words. Yeah, I'm very excited to learn more about what you're working on. And I mean, we did some tests with like Spanish and Portuguese because we're basically using the automated transcripts from YouTube. And the quality kind of depends per language. But we know for Portuguese and Spanish, it's actually quite good compared to some of the tinier languages. So yeah, very happy to talk more about this.
And how can people contact you, Erik?
So you can reach out to Eric at redditube.com, and Eric is with a K. That's also sort of important. Yeah, thanks for going back to the slide.
There's a slide somewhere.
Somewhere between those four slides.
There we go.
Okay, Merel.
Yeah, maybe I'm just interested in hearing Erik and Stijn's perspectives on this, because Stijn, I've heard your plea for more media literacy or better media literacy among audiences. However, one could also say that maybe part of the issue lies with journalism and with how journalism has covered certain topics, groups of people in society, or hasn't covered those, or hasn't done justice to certain perspectives or groups of people in society over decades. So next to a plea for media literacy, one could also say maybe we should hold a plea for journalists having better audience literacy. And if that is something, that we should vouch for, is how could, for instance, a tool like RedditTube help achieve that?
Maybe
two questions. Sorry.
Oh.
Do you agree? Should journalists be better in understanding their audiences or wider audiences? And secondly, could a tool like RedditTube help us with achieving that?
Maybe to start at the beginning, I'm not 100% convinced that this is, well, it's definitely a problem to an extent. But if you look at the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, I think at least in the Dutch media, which I've studied, there was quite a bit of attention for dissenting voices, people who disagreed with measures to curb the spread of the virus and so on. To the extent that there was there was a seat at the table of the big talk shows for people who basically didn't believe that the coronavirus was actually in existence. And I'm not sure that has really helped things. So if the way of achieving audience diversity or of giving everyone a voice is to give literally everyone a voice, I'm not sure that necessarily is the way forward to lead to a healthier media ecosystem. But I think in terms of tools, what a tool like RedditTube can do is make it easier for people to see what are people talking about, because there's the mainstream media, obviously, and then there's an enormous ecosystem of people making YouTube videos, putting stuff on TikTok, posting things on Instagram that get large engagements without necessarily being on the radar of the people in power at the more traditional and mainstream media sources. And I think that is something that could be invested in to use a lot of the tools that exist and that we have developed and that are being developed to gain insight into what's happening on social media in a nutshell, and maybe give the people in the more traditional media, let's say, tool literacy to actually use those insights that are available, but maybe not on their radar yet, to get a sense of, okay, what do people find important? What narratives are being spread outside of our own outlets? So I think that would be the gist of my answer to your questions.
Maybe one additional question. Is there legislation coming up which makes these tools much more researchable or not?
Not as far as I know. The GDPR has been a help in a way because it has at least clarified what is and isn't possible. And I know there are projects that basically ask people to do GDPR requests and then share the data they get back from platforms, which can be super useful because then you have a very detailed sense of, for example, what people have been looking at on TikTok, what they've been clicking, and then that can be used by researchers to understand what is being promoted by TikTok and that sort of thing. So in a legislative sense, that actually has been quite a big help, the GDPR, but that's the most recent development, I think.
Liz, you have raised your hand, or was it from before?
No, I raised my hand again. I wanted to pipe in, if I could, on your point about journalists. So something that I'm working on is a media guide to give to our media contacts, to give them a little guidance on how to talk about disinformation. And part of it is, what you were talking about, that they give a platform to information that is verifiably false. But so much of the disinformation that we're seeing, they're smart, the people who do this, right? They know that if they say, oh, the election isn't November 8th, it's December 8th, that's not going to get on the news, right? So they're much more subtle. They put information out of context, and it's harder to say, oh, you don't deserve a spot on our platform because it's not an outright lie. So one of the things that we're asking media to do is not to focus on individual threads of disinformation. So you see this outlandish claim and, maybe you'll get a few clicks out of it, but really the point is the bigger picture, right? It's the arch of what they're trying to do is erode trust in government systems or the electoral process. And I think something that a tool like Gratitude can do is really give that that aerial view, that it isn't one person saying one crazy thing. When you step back and you look at the network of people connected to that channel, the network of channels around it, and you look at the system as a whole, there's so much more than just that one crazy person standing in the corner saying something crazy. It's really a concerted effort to erode trust in systems that are often working. So from the US perspective, the 2020 election, our elections worked, right? It worked. So that's really the claim, right? Not that there was one election official in one county doing something crazy. And that seems to be what media really latch onto because it gets clicks. So I think, when I went on here and just looked at your website quickly, just that graphic of the circle, and then when you look around it at that network of other channels on YouTube saying stuff, it's not just that one person. So I really appreciate that visual is really powerful. And I hope that journalists, take a step back and look at that angle.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe a question to you, Liz, because a lot more research has been done in the United States than in the Netherlands at this moment. And you were talking about this network of people trying to create distrust in government. Is this purposely done, or is it accidentally, or is it? What do you know about the motives of those groups?
Oh, there's nothing accidental about it. When you look at the 2020 election, if anything, disinformation ramped up after that. Because it's a matter of creating an environment where by the time the elections come around again, people's trust is shaken. So one thing that I'm doing in my work is, when you look at COVID, for example, it's one thing to say, oh, the vaccine is not safe, right? It's another thing to say, oh, the CDC is lying to you about the safety of the vaccine, right? One has political implications, the other doesn't. It's okay to be skeptical. It's okay to say, I don't know if this is safe. But when you're then bringing in the political aspect and saying, oh, our government agency charged with your safety is lying to you, that's creating distrust. And it's just ripening the environment for people to not have faith in any government process by the time the elections come around.
Yeah. And does anybody think that we're going to figure out the problem and create good big solutions for it, or are we really somewhere on this subject? Stijn, please.
I think we'll continue to go through this on trial and error basis, figure out some things that seem to work a little bit. Sorry to be pessimistic. I don't think there's a magic bullet that someone will discover that, okay, now we solved misinformation. It's been a problem since the dawn of time, as far as I know, and it'll probably remain a problem. But we can get a better understanding of where it's happening, how it's happening, what the strategies are, who the actors are. And I think we've seen some of the ways of doing that in this panel. And we'll have to keep working on that to find where the problem is and address it in those places and hopefully make a little bit of progress.
Yeah, I mean, and I do think that on a smaller scale, we can make some sort of difference. I mean, if you look at a lot of the disinformation, it's often driven by just simply making money. So if you demonetize content, you basically pull away one source of revenue. Like even I think in the case I was trying to show with the girl that was posting those videos, I think if you would even not show like the views around these videos, you pull away one incentive to release such videos. So I do think small things that you could change that might be able to make some sort of difference. But I do agree with Stijn that, I mean, this whole disinformation, it's older than the internet itself. It's difficult to tackle that.
Okay, Merel, last word to you.
Maybe also ending on a little bit of a positive note. I do think what is positive is that the phenomenon is, I think, on the radar of a wide group of people, including the radar of funders, supporting organizations that are doing great work regarding this topic. I think several of the very unfortunate events that we've seen over the past, 5 to 10 years have contributed to that. And hopefully all of this will now lead to some progress with regards to the topic.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to thank everybody participating in the session, especially Merel, Erik, and Stijn. And I hope we will have a physical event next year on MOSFest, and we're going to do another session, I think, on disinformation, because the problem will still be there, maybe with better solutions by then. And please, if you want to apply for an innovative internet project, please take a look at the website of SIDN Fund. Within 2 weeks, then we will launch the call and maybe we can support ideas from you. And I wish you a very happy MOSFest. Thank you.
Thanks.